On September 4, 1622, 28 Spanish ships left the harbor at Havana. They were already 6 weeks behind schedule. The captains knew the hurricane season had begun, knew the risks of a late departure, and sailed anyway. Aboard the rearguard galleon, a vessel named for a parish church in Madrid, the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, sat a cargo so vast that it had taken workers 2 full months just to catalog and load it. Silver from the mines of Bolivia and Peru, gold from the interior of Colombia, emeralds prized among the most flawless ever pulled from the earth, pearls from the coasts of Venezuela. The Atocha was, by any measure, a floating treasury, the accumulated wealth of an empire, packaged for a crossing that would never be completed. 2 days out of port, the convoy sailed into a hurricane. By the morning of September 6th, the sea had claimed 8 of the 28 ships. The Atocha went down in approximately 56 feet of water, somewhere between the Marquesas Keys and the Dry Tortugas. Of her 265 passengers and crew, only 5 survived, 3 sailors and 2 enslaved men, clinging through the night to the stump of the mizzenmast, the only fragment of the ship that still breached the surface. Everyone else was gone, and with them, a cargo that, by modern estimates, was worth somewhere between $250 million and $500 million. The Spanish crown understood immediately what had been lost. Within weeks, salvage vessels were dispatched. Divers, many of them enslaved people forced into the work, descended using primitive brass diving bells fitted with glass windows. They searched for years. They recovered portions of the Atocha's sister ship, the Santa Margarita, which had run aground nearby. But the Atocha itself eluded them. The hurricane had scattered her remains across miles of seafloor. The wreckage shifted. The sand consumed it. In 6 decades of trying, Spain never found her. That failure had consequences far beyond one galleon. The 1622 fleet carried a significant portion of the Crown's expected revenue for the year. Spain was already stretched dangerously thin, locked into the ruinous expenditures of the 30 Years' War. The loss of the treasure fleet compelled the Crown to borrow further from foreign bankers and even sell off warships to stay solvent. One storm in one night had punched a hole in the finances of the most powerful empire on Earth, and the treasure that could have repaired it lay somewhere beneath the turquoise shallows of the Florida Straits, slowly being buried under centuries of sand and coral growth. This is the background against which the modern story begins. Not in the 17th century, but in the 20th, in a world where the idea of sunken Spanish gold had passed from living memory into legend, and where the technology to search for it was only just becoming available. Mel Fisher was born in 1922 in Hobart, Indiana. He grew up on a chicken farm. He studied hydraulic engineering at Purdue University. He served in the military during the Second World War. After the war, he moved to California and opened one of the state's first dive shops, a modest storefront called Sea to Sea. Nothing about his early biography suggests the trajectory his life would follow. He was a Midwestern man with practical skills and an impractical dream, the kind of dream that in most lives fades into a quiet hobby. Fisher's did not. By the late 1960s, Fisher had relocated to the Florida Keys and begun what would become a 16 and a half year obsession. Finding the wreck of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, he founded a company called Treasure Salvers, Inc., pooled investments from friends and strangers, and assembled a rotating crew of divers, researchers, and marine archaeologists. Every morning, he reportedly greeted his team with the same 4 words: 2 days the day. It became a personal mantra, repeated so consistently that it ceased to be optimism and became something closer to liturgy. A daily act of faith performed against mounting evidence that the ocean would not yield. The early years produced small encouragements. In 1973, silver bars matching the Atocha's cargo manifest surfaced. In 1975, Fisher's eldest son, Dirk, located 5 bronze cannons on the seafloor, whose markings would eventually be matched to the galleon. That confirmation, solid, physical proof that the wreck was real and within reach, should have been the turning point. Instead, it became the site of the story's central tragedy. Just days after the cannons were found, Dirk Fisher, his wife Angel, and a fellow diver named Rick Gage were aboard a salvage vessel called the Northwind when the boat's bilge pumps failed during the night. The Northwind capsized and sank. All three drowned. It is worth pausing here because this is the moment that separates the story of the Atocha from a simple tale of underwater treasure. Mel Fisher had lost his son, his daughter, in-law, and a close colleague to the very search that had consumed his life. The rational choice, perhaps even the compassionate one, would have been to stop. He did not. He continued diving. He continued saying, 2 days the day. Whether that constitutes perseverance or compulsion, whether it is heroic or reckless, depends on where you stand. The answer probably changes depending on how the story ends. And the story ended, at least in its most dramatic chapter, on July 20th, 1985. On that day, Fisher's team finally located the Atocha's main cargo hold, the so-called motherlode. What they found on the seafloor was staggering, even by the inflated standards of treasure. Hunting mythology, 40 tons of gold and silver, roughly 114,000 pieces gold doubloons, over 1,000 silver ingots, and perhaps most remarkable, a cache of Colombian emeralds from the legendary Muzo mines, stones of such extraordinary color and clarity that they remain among the finest known specimens in the world. The estimated value of the recovered treasure was approximately $450 million. It was, at the time, the most valuable shipwreck recovery ever documented, a record it held until the discovery of the San Jose off Colombia's coast, decades later. But the discovery did not resolve the story. It complicated it. The state of Florida immediately asserted title to the wreck, arguing that the Atocha lay within state jurisdictional waters, and that the treasure therefore belonged, at least in part, to the public. Fisher's company was forced into a contract giving Florida 25% of everything recovered. The decision was a landmark in Admiralty law. Treasure salvers challenged the arrangement. What followed was 8 years of litigation. A legal odyssey that climbed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In 1992, the court ruled in Fisher's favor, awarding his company sole ownership of the treasure. The decision was a landmark in Admiralty law, establishing precedents about salvage rights, the law of fines, and the limits of state sovereignty over submerged objects. Fisher died of cancer in 1998, at 76. His family continued the salvage operation. Divers still work the site today because only a portion of the Atocha's treasure has been recovered. The stern castle, the section of the ship where the captain's quarters would have held the most precious items, including more gold and the bulk of the Muzo emeralds, has never been found. It may have separated from the hull during the hurricane and come to rest miles from the main wreck, buried under 4 centuries of sediment. There is a parallel story that belongs here because it illustrates how differently the same premise, a fortune lying on the ocean floor, can unfold depending on the character of the person who goes looking for it. In 1857, the SS Central America, a sidewheel steamer nicknamed the Ship of Gold, sank in a hurricane off the coast of the Carolinas. She was carrying 425 passengers and 30,000 pounds of California Gold Rush gold. The sinking killed 425 people and contributed directly to the Panic of 1857, one of the worst financial crises of 19th century America. The gold, valued in modern terms at well over $1 billion, lay on the seabed at a depth of more than 7,000 feet, far beyond the reach of any salvage technology available for the next century. In 1988, a Columbus, Ohio, based engineer named Tommy Thompson led an expedition that located the Central America using Bayesian search theory and a purpose-built remotely operated vehicle. It was a genuine feat of applied science and engineering. The recovered gold, estimated at $100 to $150 million, included an 80-pound ingot that sold for $8 million, at the time the most valuable piece of currency in the world. Thompson was hailed as a visionary. Then the story turned. 39 insurance companies filed suit, arguing that they held valid claims to the gold because they had paid out damages in the 19th century. After protracted litigation, 92% of the treasure was awarded to Thompson's Discovery Group in 1996. But investors who had funded the expedition to the tune of $12.5 million alleged that Thompson had failed to provide returns or even basic accounting of profits. Crew members made similar claims. In 2009, records surfaced showing Thompson held over $4 million in offshore accounts in the Cook Islands. By 2012, rather than face court-ordered disclosure, Thompson vanished. He became a fugitive, living under an assumed identity until us marshals located him in 2015. Thompson was ordered to turn over 500 gold coins whose location he refused to disclose. He spent more than a decade in federal custody, first on contempt charges for his silence, then on a criminal sentence before being released in early 2026 at the age of 73. The coins have never been accounted for. A jury awarded Thompson's defrauded investors over $19 million in damages. The man who once represented the promise of deep-sea exploration became, in the end, a cautionary tale about what happens when the lure of treasure overrides every other consideration. These two stories, Fisher's and Thompson's, are not just adventure narratives. They sit at the center of a genuine and ongoing debate about who owns the past when it lies underwater. The traditional framework in admiralty law draws a distinction between salvage, in which a finder is compensated for rescuing property from marine peril, and the law of fines, in which abandoned property is awarded to whoever recovers it. For centuries, this was sufficient. But the modern era introduced complications that the old legal framework never anticipated. Advanced sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and satellite positioning have made it possible to locate wrecks that were previously unreachable. Commercial treasure hunters can now access sites that, a generation ago, were the exclusive province of natural decay and deep-sea organisms. Archaeologists and cultural heritage organizations have raised pointed objections. The 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, adopted partly in response to the controversies surrounding the Atocha and similar finds, takes the position that submerged wrecks are cultural sites, not salvage opportunities. The convention explicitly rejects the application of the law of salvage and the law of fines to underwater cultural heritage. It argues that commercial exploitation inevitably damages or destroys the archaeological context of a site, the spatial relationships between objects, the stratigraphy of sediment, the structural remains of the vessel itself. Information that, once disturbed, can never be recovered regardless of how carefully the gold is catalogued. Fisher's defenders counter that his operation employed professional archaeologists including Dr. Duncan Mathewson, who served as chief archaeologist during the Atocha salvage. They argue that without private sector funding and initiative, the Atocha would have remained buried indefinitely, its treasures and its historical data equally inaccessible. This is not a trivial point. Governments rarely allocate the resources necessary for deep-water archaeological expeditions, unless there is a compelling commercial or strategic reason to do so. The uncomfortable reality is that much of what we know about 17th-century Spanish maritime trade, shipbuilding, and colonial wealth comes to us precisely because someone was motivated by profit to go looking. There is also the question of national inheritance. Spain has periodically asserted sovereign claims to vessels flying the Spanish flag, regardless of where they sank or how many centuries have elapsed. Colombia, in the case of the San Jose, has argued that a wreck found in its territorial waters belongs to the Colombian people. The United States passed the Abandoned Shipwreck Act in 1988, granting states title to certain historic wrecks found in state waters. Each of these positions reflects a different theory of ownership, one rooted in flag sovereignty, another in territorial jurisdiction, another in the principle of cultural patrimony. None of them is universally accepted. What makes the Atocha so persistent as a subject of fascination is not really the gold, though the gold is extraordinary. It is the convergence of so many competing forces: personal ambition, family tragedy, legal precedent, imperial history, colonial exploitation, archaeological ethics, and the basic human impulse to believe that something magnificent might be hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for someone stubborn enough to find it. The emeralds from the Muzo mines were torn from the earth in what is now Colombia by enslaved and conscripted indigenous laborers working under Spanish colonial overseers. The silver came from Potos, in present-day Bolivia, one of the most brutal mining operations in human history. The treasure that sat in the Atocha's hold was not simply wealth. It was the distilled product of an extractive empire, the physical evidence of a system that generated enormous value for a European monarchy at the cost of millions of lives in the Americas. Recovering it from the seafloor and placing it in museum cases or auction houses does not erase that origin. It merely adds another chapter to the long biography of these objects, another set of hands through which they pass on their way through history. Mel Fisher's operation has, by one estimate, recovered only about half of what went down with the Atocha. The stern castle, the missing piece, the section that may hold the most concentrated wealth, remains unaccounted for somewhere on the seafloor between the Marquesas Keys and the Dry Tortugas. Divers continue to search. Technology improves, the ocean floor shifts, and the question that attaches to every such enterprise, whether we are preserving the past or plundering it, remains as unresolved as the location of the missing gold. What is clear is that the 400-year arc of the Atocha contains something more instructive than a treasure map. It is a record of how value moves through time, how it is mined and minted, loaded and lost, sought and found, claimed and contested. The gold does not care who holds it. The emeralds are indifferent to the hands that polish them. But the choices made around these objects, who dives for them, who dies for them, who profits from them, who argues over them in courtrooms, tell us a great deal about the civilizations that produce both the treasure and the desire to possess it. The ocean floor holds many things: ships, cargo, human remains, centuries of sediment, and the unanswered residue of every ambition that was large enough to cross the sea and unlucky enough to end there.